like to welcome everyone to the My Horse University and Extension's Horse Quest live webinar titled Horse Manure, a Renewable Resource. The presenter today is Dr. Ann Swinker from Penn State University. Dr. Swinker is an associate professor in equine sciences and a horse extension specialist. She has been involved in the horse business for over 35 years. Ann began her career as manager of an Arabian horse stables in southwestern Pennsylvania. During that time, she was involved in breeding, training, marketing, importing, and showing a herd of purebred Arabian horses. Her research activities have addressed several management and environmental issues, such as stable air quality, small acreage management, composting and manure management, and water quality, in addition to horse behavior and reproductive issues. Please note that you are able to ask questions during the presentation via the text chat at the bottom of your screen. The questions will be answered by Mike Harper, who is a master's student from Penn State University, and also possibly from Dr. Christine Skelly from Michigan State University. There will also be time at the end of the presentation for additional questions for Ann. The presentation from tonight will be recorded and uploaded to our website if you would like to review the presentation at a later date. So at this time, I will turn the presentation over to Dr. Swinker.
Thank you very much, and everybody welcome. I hope you can hear me. The topic we're going to talk about today is something we all have to deal with. And since we artificially manage our horses compared to how nature intended, we keep them as confined animal feeding operations, confined animal operations, and just feeding operations. And a lot of those words are used in a lot of legislative issues depending on the state that you're from. But we all try to keep our horses confined and housed in a safe, attractive kind of a facility like you see in this picture. But when you confine animals, you generate manure, and we also use a lot of bedding with horses as compared to other species. And this requires a lot more management. And along with the management comes a lot more work. And whether you use a skid loader or a wheelbarrow, you still have to clean pens, runs, and stalls. We need to pick up the manure in our paddocks and corrals and pens. And so this creates a management problem for us. And when you have a problem, you need to have a plan. And before you can plan your manure handling system or management, there's a lot of things that go into developing a plan. First of all, we need to pick a location and a stall to house the manure or stockpile the manure. And you want to pay close attention to all of these items above. This will be the topic of this discussion. And we also need to consider, when developing a plan for our manure, our zoning regulations and guidelines, nutrient management regulations in your state, building codes, and any new zoning guidelines and nutrient management regulations that have happened either statewide or in your local county or ordinance, in addition to national regulations. But I think the key thing is we need to stay on top of the pile. We need to actively compost all stall waste. We need to stockpile this manure and stall waste for later use, either to put on crop fields as needed or spread on pastures. I want to precaution you, and we'll talk about parasite overloads and some things we can do to control that. Or you want to just have your manure hauled off of the property. In any case, whether you're going to use the manure on your property or you're going to have it hauled away by someone else, it helps to reduce the amount of bedding used by composting. It'll also reduce this, and we'll go through some procedures to help you do that. Or just give the manure away. It does have a fertilizing value, and we'll discuss that a little further also. Before you do anything with the manure, as soon as you put it in the wheelbarrow and bring it out of the stall, you need to have a site where you are going to put this manure or handle it. So we'll refer to that as the manure handling site. And when you're picking a location to pile this manure, turning this into a little bit of science, we want to consider the topography of the site that you're planning on dumping this manure pile. You have to consider, like any water flow through that area. You definitely don't want to be putting it near a stream or a flood-prone area. You don't want to put it on a steep slope. You want to pick a flat, impermeable site that has a deep water table. So your ideal site where you're going to pile this manure needs to be 200 feet away from any water source, including ponds, streams, irrigation ditches, and particularly your water source or your wellhead. So you want to store this dry manure either in a stockpile for future use, or you can actively start composting it. And as you can see, the difference between a composted area and just stockpiled is the shape and the way we're going to manage these piles. Okay, both, whether you're going to stockpile it or be actively composting it, again, select that high site that's dry. Keep it away from any bodies of water, but you want it accessible. Like, you don't want it so far away that no one wants to wheel the wheelbarrow that far. Then you have to be able to confine that pile so that there's not runoff running through that and washing all the nutrients out of the pile. So you can do this. A lot of people will make a permanent manure handling site with concrete or blacktop macadam, or you want to create a hard surface that's a little more economical, and you can do this by, as you can see in this picture, you can see the bare ground. The brown part is where we start with the soil. You can put a geotextile fabric, that's a woven fabric that is under a lot of road surfaces. We use those a lot, like even when we make sacrifice areas in our pastures. And you could put gravel on top of that, and then a finer gravel that'll pack down. Here in Pennsylvania, we use a lot of limestone screenings for that top layer, and that packs down pretty hard like concrete. Or you can use sand or something else that's easily available and economical in your area. The key thing is you want to surround that storage pad site with grass or some vegetative filter to help, because there's going to be times when the water from rain will rush through that, and you want to filter out those nutrients before it escapes your property. So how big of a storage site do you need for this waste space? Keep in mind that 1,000-pound horse, an average size horse, produces anywhere from 45 to 50 pounds of manure daily, plus bedding, so that equates to about 730 cubic feet a year of waste material per horse. So depending on how many horses you have as to what kind of a site you need, in both these pictures below, there's a lot of farms with these giant manure piles, and that's the person standing on top of it. But you could easily turn that into a composted area where that nutrient is captured in that area and not escaping and causing pollution. So I want to talk about some traditional uses of horse manure, or any manure. Most of us know that manure is a cheap, easy way to get fertilizing nutrients back into the soil, and manure also contains a lot of organic matter that actually helps the health and structure of our soil. So we all do know that you can use it as fertilizer, and you can apply it composted back even onto some of your pasture or grass fields or hay fields. But it's ideally used in crop fields, and it's good to keep the animals off of these areas where you just recently spread the manure until the weather permits it to be washed in. We'll talk a little bit further about that. Some other options is a lot of people, we just did a survey here in Pennsylvania where 48% of the people haul their manure off the premises or sell it to someone else. And the key thing is that you need to contract with someone, and in some states you have to have the person that hauls the manure off has to be certified as a certified manure hauler. I know we're doing that in Pennsylvania through our Department of Ag, and part of your plan for manure management is that a certified person hauls that off. Each state will be a little bit different with their nutrient management regulations, so you definitely want to check with your Department of Agriculture to make sure what your regulations are. In the East, we have a lot of horse farms that produce manure and bedding for mushroom growers. This part of the country is like one of the capitals for mushroom growers, but they do require that the bedding is only made with straw, and that this compost is a straw horse manure compost. And otherwise, if it's wood products, they're not interested. And as you can see, most of our horse farms do include an awful lot of material, bedding material in their manure piles, and this is showing one that was hauled off for mushroom intent to make mushroom media, and you could see the wheat straw that was in this. You have to consider the bedding type that you have, how absorbent it is. There's a lot of research projects that have been done by Cooperative Extension and the universities looking at the absorbency, the ability of these products to absorb moisture. And as you can see, the wood products are pretty good. We have straw products that rate quite high at absorbency, and there's even some paper products out there right now too that do a pretty good job. And it's interesting, hay is very absorbent. However, we don't recommend using hay because the horses tend to eat a high percentage of the product that they're bedded on. The next thing I think we need to consider after we've selected our manure site that we're handling our manure in, whether to compost or not. And composting is really a natural aerobic process that helps stabilize this organic material. It also reduces the smell, the pathogens, weed seeds if we heat it up to a certain temperature, and it reduces the volume. And I have some slides we'll show you a little later that it reduces it by 25 to 50% in volume, which also helps with the spacing problem. So when we compost correctly, it's an easy natural biological process. It's recycling, it's biosecure, it's environmentally sound, lowers odor, lowers fly production, all the most wonderful green things that we can do. It's a very complex but simple procedure. We're not going to go through that. We have a lot of courses that teach you through Cooperative Extension at all of the universities. You could even join a Master Gardener group that'll teach you all these different things about composting. But the key thing is that there's microorganisms and these different bugs that break down these larger particles. They use the bacteria and fungi, use the bedding and manure as a food source, and that's what breaks these particles down. And microbial activity is related to the availability of that food source, the surface area available to the microorganisms, whether there's moisture and oxygen available. So we want to take this manure and bedding, we're going to include water and oxygen, and it releases CO2 and vapors, and it turns into a stabilized organic residue. Generally, you want to shape your composting pile in a cone shape, as you could see in this slide. It's a windrow that's probably about 3 to 4 feet high 3 to maybe 6 feet wide. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that does. And oxygen is taken into the pile of manure and carbon content, which is really our bedding, and releases CO2. And if we pile it like we talked about these windrows, you get this chimney effect where it's pulling in oxygen, aerating the pile, and heat and CO2 then is released. Then this is a unimproved surface. It's just on the ground. They didn't prepare a surface, a hard surface like we talked about. And the manure and bedding is just piled there. And what this is doing is a passive windrow that's unimproved, and it will take a little bit longer to compost a site like this, but it eventually does. But if you actively put the windrows out and turn them, and we'll talk about some things that they need to be able to compost, you can compost manure fairly quickly in a matter of few weeks versus, several years. Now this is a more active compost. It requires turning the pile. You don't really need a front end loader or a skid loader. Actually, if you only have a couple of horses, we'll show you some quick and easy ways to do it. And this is a very large pile where they're composting hay that needs to be decomposed or recycled. But whether it's a big pile or a little pile, they both require oxygen, and you have to turn it to do that, moisture, and a carbon-nitrogen ratio. So to properly compost manure, you need to let it heat up to 145 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you can heat it up to at least 145 degrees, this kills most parasite eggs, equine parasite eggs, and it also kills weed seeds. And as you can see, this particular pile's heated up pretty well, and we'll talk about some ways you can monitor that. Okay, some of the things that directly impact the microbial population in your manure pile, and you have to have the microbes because they're the ones that cause the composting to happen. The key thing is your carbon to nitrogen ratio. And like we said, the carbon is our bedding. That's the wood chips, the straw, the hay, and the nitrogen is our manure. It's not one of the higher manures with nitrogen, but there's enough nitrogen in the carbon to nitrogen ratio in our manure to actively help this composting or to help the microbial population. So the oxygen content is very important. We need to have moisture. If the pile is too dry, that'll slow down the composting. And we also want to monitor the temperature because we can, if it's not composting, it'll be a lower temperature. If it's composting too quickly, there's some things we need to do too because that'll kill our microorganisms. And we want a pH that's not acidic. It could be in a wide range. And then our particle size. It's very difficult to compost an entire tree, but wood shavings compost really quickly in a pile. It requires a lot of oxygen to compost, and so we need to pay attention to our temperature. And composting occurs in a range of 50 degrees Fahrenheit to 160 degrees. Once you get too far over 160, you may be heating the pile up too much, and that might be killing off our microorganisms. So we don't want the pile to get too hot. There are composting thermometers that you could purchase at any home and lawn and garden center. Some of our extension offices that have active Master Gardener programs also have this, can tell you where to purchase these materials, but almost any lawn and garden center has them. And the thermometer is a couple of feet long, and this is what the top would show you. Okay, so let's go back to the carbon-nitrogen ratio. Okay, we need to have a carbon to nitrogen ratio, an ideal mix of this range would be like 20 to 30 to 1, which is an awful lot of carbon content or bedding, which our horse people do really well. And you know, we want to pay close attention to this, because if we don't have enough nitrogen, we may have to add some as commercial fertilizer. And we also need to pay close attention too, if we have way too much nitrogen, a lot of this leaches out as gas or can leach into water sources or into the soil. Now, the phase of composting to keep it active, this particular chart is showing the weeks of composting and the temperature. And you know, when you put the carbon and nitrogen or bedding and manure into the manure pile, after a couple of weeks you'll start to see the active phase where it heats up, you know, it starts to go over 100 degrees in temperature, and then as it starts to cure, you'll see it start to drop off. And you can monitor this with your thermometer. And the key thing is, if you don't provide the carbon to nitrogen, the moisture, keep the temperature going or not let it get too hot, and provide oxygen, it's pretty easy to let this procedure happen on its own. But a lot of people make the mistake of putting out a manure pile that is just so gigantic, and they never turn it, and it kind of encapsulates that product within that pile, and no oxygen can get in there, resulting in, you know, almost preserving that material. And all of us have seen manure piles, when you dig down into it, a large manure pile, when they're removing it, some of that manure looks as fresh as the day it hit the ground. So, you know, actively composting it, monitoring the temperature, getting it through the curing phase is all very important. And if you do this, like you can see from this chart, within 6 to 8 weeks you can have some pretty nice material that can be utilized as compost. Some other things that we need to do: airflow through these piles is very critical. It needs oxygen in order for the compost to be accomplished, and you need about 20% oxygen that, you know, is normally in the air, but in this pile we need at least 5 to 10% for optimum composting processes to happen. So if we have less than 5% oxygen in the pile, it can result in, again, this process stopping. Again, the pile, the more oxygen you have, the more the microbes are able to consume and start this whole process. So the amount of moisture in the pile is very important too. And you know, like, too much moisture is not good, but around 50 to 65% is optimal for microbial activity. And again, the pH, fungi can operate a lot easier than bacteria. Bacteria are a little more sensitive, and they need to have more of a positive pH, more, you know, they don't tolerate an acid pH. They are more in a buffer zone. So we want to pay attention to that also. And you can actually just use a regular soil test that you get at your cooperative extension office to test your pH of that manure. Okay, some optimum ranges again that we need: carbon to nitrogen ratio, we need at least like a 20 to 30 to 1. Moisture around 50 to 65%. We have to provide some oxygen into that pile, either by actively turning it, or you can even put PVC sewage pipes that have air into your pile. If you are, when you're putting it together, you could put those pipes throughout your pile. That'll bring oxygen into the core of the manure pile. Again, acceptable pH around a 5.5 to an 2, particle size about 1/4 to 3 inches. That's pretty large. Optimum composting temperature 110 to 160, and 140 is pretty optimal for most of the weed seeds and parasite problems that we have. Again, particle size, this is showing real fine sawdust. This is real coarse wood chips. This is a mixture of both, and this is generally what most horse people are getting in the prepackaged materials. Some of the newer pelleted wood chip products too that swell up kind of look more like sawdust after they've been used, and there's even some other products that are coming out on the market that are pelleted that after being used kind of look like what we have in this picture. So again, our solid manure storage, you could either have your manure pile or your compost pile covered. In some parts of the country, some people will, in the more rainy areas of the country, may have to tarp it. This requires a lot more cost and labor. You want to stack or stockpile it in a well-drained area until it's removed or used. And again, you want to follow regulations in your part of the country as far as storing this manure and preventing runoff. Now, some other than just dumping the manure on the ground, there's some simple manure storage facilities. The one up in our left top corner is more what you would see on a dairy farm, pretty extensive for their corrals and manure handling. But these other ones are for smaller acreage operations or some horse operations, and a lot of people would like to have 2 or 3 bins available so that they could have one manure pile that's just starting and the other one that's a few weeks or more, it's curing and more available for use. So these are just some pretty simple designs. You can meet with your county extension office or your NRCS, Natural Resources office, to help you be able to develop a plan for yourself. But just want to talk about when you're developing these facilities, please use common sense. Are you going to land applicate it? What type of bedding do you have? How far do you have to haul it? The distances you have to haul, the volumes you're hauling, how much space is required for you to store your manure. I want to show you this one facility at the top of this page is really for a very large operation. One, you can see they're storing a lot of material here. It's very expensive to put in. Down below is just a manure pile. They have theirs hauled off weekly. This particular barn has 10 horses, so the odds are they don't need a very expensive manure handling operation with their management scheme. So use common sense, know your system, decide what your plan is. Here's a very simple design. As you can see in this particular slide, they don't have a whole lot of manure, but they have quite a investment in their manure handling system. But this was required by a nutrient management plan that this particular farm was putting together. Here's some other designs, and again, you want it to fit your goal, your operation. How much storage area are you going to particularly need? Again, the top slide shows a pretty simple design where they're actively composting under roof. This lower one has a lot more material that they're composting. And again, you can consult a lot of offices. There's like your extension office or your NRCS office. Here's a 2-bin design where they're actually using chicken wire to hold it. Very one to put in. Again, a 2-bin system. One's cooking while the other one is just starting, or there's an empty bin. So they always seem to, have manure coming at different stages. This is just another design of for a small horse operation. it depends on what fits your management scheme. This is the economy model. This was a composting project that we did in Colorado when I worked at Colorado. And we're just using pellets that are being held up by a chain link fence that was behind it. So you have a lot of aeration around those piles. And these three bedding sources, this was part of a bedding and project that we did on bedding types and respiratory problems with different bedding types and dust. You could tell that one is straw, the one in the middle is paper bedding, and the other one on the end, the larger pile, was sawdust. And you could see that the paper bedding was actually decomposing quite quick and packs down very easily. We had a hard time keeping oxygen in that particular pile. It's not that it was breaking down, it's just that it was packing down. Later we put all three bedding types together, and when they were all together it really decomposed quickly. But depending on your bedding type, really your amount of time and how easy it is to aerate kind of can slow down the process. So size does matter. Here's another site where you could see the walls of this particular manure handling facility. It has a drainage area under it. It has buffer areas on the outside. And this is probably 3 years worth of manure. So whoever advised this particular owner to put this large of a unit in there wasn't really fitting their management scheme. Then the other slide, this is about 1 week's worth of manure, and it's overflowing, and maybe they should have put in a unit similar to the one next to it. But when you do this, think about your operation, talk to some professionals, get some help if you're going to put a manure handling facility in. So if you're putting a facility in, you need to put one in that will hold or accumulate this solid material. Put in something that's inexpensive, that other manure handling systems were developed to separate liquids from solids. Horses don't have much liquid, it's all solid. So when you're working with some of the professionals, or if the agencies that are regulating manure handling systems come to visit you, keep reminding them that these are horses, not dairy operations or hog operations. But the key thing is these facilities keep leaching from happening. It holds the manure in place, and no matter, even if you don't have a stacking facility, you just have a manure pile, always have grass or vegetative buffer area to help filter this out. Now I want to talk about, we know we can spread horse manure on pastures, fields, crop fields, wherever we're going to spread this compost. But I want to talk about some other uses for horse manure. A lot of landscapers would like to talk to you maybe about hauling off your manure. You could work out some sort of a deal, whether they haul it off or you haul it off, or they pay you for it, depending on the part of the country you're in, how much construction's going on. And right now the housing market's not doing so good. But for some reason, a lot of the landscapers and garden centers are telling us when times are bad, people stay home and plant flowers. But we know that this material does a really nice job at changing the soil texture in our flower beds. So compost is always in demand for that type of a purpose. Some people will use this compost on their outdoor arenas. While I was at Colorado, we also did an air quality study with trainers and riding instructors, and we also found out that the instructors or trainers that used manure right out of the stall or even out of the compost pile for their indoor arenas were like 10 times more likely to get bacterial pneumonia sometime during the year, and was 75% higher in getting rhinitis or bronchitis throughout the year. Although, that could just be correlated with how often we're outside. But I really think that the bacteria that's in that material really should not be used in an indoor arena. I think it's fine to use in an outdoor arena to mix in with your surfaces to make a cushy footing if that's what you want to do with your manure. But there are some health precautions with using it in indoor areas. There's a lot of folks that use this compost product on sustainable trails as footing, and I want to stress sustainable. When you talk to a lot of the backcountry riders groups, the state horse councils that are doing sustainable trail building and maintenance, it's very important that these trails not be straight up and down a hillside and wash this bedding down into water sources and into streams, into pristine streams. We have a hard enough time with the trail use and our manure on trail use to be adding to that problem. But it does make a nice footing once it's composted and it's not fresh manure. But it's also a possible use with precautions. Now I want to talk about something new that a lot of the universities have gotten involved with just recently, and a lot of our livestock folks across the country are now experiencing not being able to have dead animals removed from their properties. I'm going to go through a project that we just recently did here at Penn State University on mortality composting. And as you can see the carcass in the middle of this pile that they're going to compost this entire animal. And this may be the way we may have to go with the reduction of renderers that no longer pick up dead stock. But just want to talk about the potential of using manure, carbon content, particularly our manure that we produce and stable waste, because we have such a high percent of carbon content or wood chips or straw. So this animal bedding and waste can also be used for mortality composting. These are mortality compost piles. We're real concerned about runoff, so wherever you put these piles, you want to make sure that we don't have a lot of moisture running through those. But you want to use plenty of absorbent bedding. Ideally about 24 inches is good. You want to have a couple of layers before you put the dead animal in the compost pile. And actually, you'll read a lot of things where they say you have to dismantle the carcass, which our research is showing here at Penn State you really don't have to do that, but you do have, there are these spears that you put into the carcass, particularly like in cattle. The large stomach or rumen will tend to swell up and blow up. If you're able to put a spear in there that keeps it aerated, then the carcass stays at the normal size that it was put into the pile. And again, this is showing 2 feet of bedding, then the dead carcass, then another 2 foot put into windrows. Here's a dairy cow being processed this way. It's quite interesting if you use the windrow procedure. A cow, a 1,000-pound cow in this particular picture can be composted, very quickly. They suggest turning the pile at 90 days and then continuing composting for another 4 to 6 months. And within that time, sometimes it'll cook up a little faster than that, but 6 months is ideal to compost a 1,000-pound carcass. And so this is very new. It's some morbid things to talk about, but it's a reality. I always say if you have livestock, sometime you're going to have dead stock. I know this is hard to talk about, but it's a real possibility that you may not be able to have these carcasses removed from your property. A lot of people ask about the bones, and yes, some of the like immature animals totally digest and can be land applied. However, in some very large mature animals, some of the bigger bones tend to take a little bit longer to decompose. Whether we're just doing a manure pile or a mortality compost, or just even around your stable area or your corrals close up to the barn, you definitely want to have vegetative buffer strips put in. This particular diagram is pretty extensive. Usually you see those on large animal operations where they're funneling the runoff off of those areas. We don't need something this elaborate unless you're running, you know, a large number of horses in a very close-up area. But I think we could look at this layout, and at least even if we just had a grassy area around all of our corrals or around all of our manure piles, we need to channel and reduce the amount of nutrients that escape, you know, any of these manure piles or holding areas. Another thing we need to consider with manure piles or composting any of this is odor. We want to remember we want to stay good friends with our neighbors. Just the sight of the manure pile, even if it doesn't smell, to a neighbor or a non-livestock person, it does. It's a psychological effect. So, you know, we want to take odor into consideration, and some factors that affect odor: again, the size of the manure pile, the wind speed and direction, you know, how concentrated is the manure with bedding, and also if you add in some vegetative buffers, trees and shrubs tend to, you know, change the direction and wind speed, and these are some things that you could look at for odor control. So I just kind of want to summarize a little bit here. Like, each farm really should have a manure management plan to either, you know, utilize their own manure or dispose of it or have it hauled away. But you need to consider that on your operation almost as well as you do your, you know, your nutrient feeding scheme that you come up for your stable or horse operation. So you want to, again, store all manure in a dry, level, impermeable location, free from stormwater runoff. You want to manage stormwater to prevent manure contamination of water and eliminate runoff. You know, you may have to put in some ditches or something to catch some of that or deter where it goes. We want to actively compost our manure and bedding. And you want to put it in a location where the animals don't have access. You know, you don't want them running on top of the pile, running the pile over, although they could aerate it if that's the only thing you could do, but it's not a real healthy environment for those horses. And another thing about our manure pile, we definitely want to keep it out of sight and out of mind. So if you're located along a highway, don't have it piled right there where people can see it. Don't put it on the corner of your property that's right next to your neighbor's bedroom window. You want to be considerate. You want it, again, think of all those things: easy access, easy to move it in and out. So out of sight, out of mind's probably, you know, a good thing that you want to do. And I think we'll go ahead and start looking at some of the questions. I know that Mike's been answering some of them, and maybe we could verbally take some of those. Well, they're going fast. All right. Let's see, were there any real interesting ones, Mike?
Well, the simple one is the manure. We just tested analysis lab.
Okay. Most of you have access to a cooperative extension office in your county, and they have the same tests that you use to test your soil when you go for a soil analysis can also look at the same manure content in your manure. Some of the universities do have a compost test. It's like the same kind of a soil test, but it looks at some other things in the compost. However, those are a little more expensive to do than just your regular soil test. But if you're interested in the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium levels and pH of your compost after you've finished composting it, you could just use your regular manure test that you can purchase at the cooperative extension offices in each county. I see one question about flies. How do you keep flies away? And someone else says that they use fly parasites. Fly parasites work real well, but you have to remember that you have to take time to let their population establish. And if you use any pesticides in that area where you're establishing your fly predators, you'll kill those because they're insects also. So any insecticide that you use to control flies as you get, if you're losing your patience and you spray, you probably killed that population too. So if you're going to use predators, you may have to be a little patient letting them take effect.
Look at the question right below. It's by the blue, right under the blue link. Up a little bit, right under the blue.
Go up a little bit. Oh, I was going to say read it to me.
Can manure urine have enough pathogens, bacteria to convert with contamination in well water?
Okay. Someone asked earlier if manure and urine in the manure pile has like the bacteria and pathogens to be able to contaminate your well water, and the answer is yes, and that's why we suggest keeping it at least 200 feet away from a wellhead or water source. We also recommend an impermeable surface. That's why we talked about you can do a cement pad or a asphalt pad, or even if you would just put that geotextile with gravel to try to make an impermeable surface to store that in. So the answer to that is yes, those nutrients, generally it's the nitrogen that can move quickly through the soil. Phosphorus does not. I know we talk a lot about phosphorus in pastures, but that's dealing more with erosion, not penetration through the soil, because it moves slower through the soil. But there are pathogens and bacteria that can, if that water leaches through to your wellhead, if you have a low water table, it is a possibility. So that's why we recommend an impermeable surface to store that in. Here's one: how do we compost with or without a spreader? Actually, when you put your windrows together, like we said, if you could put the sewage type PVC pipe underneath the manure as you pile it in there, that has holes in it that can let air penetrate through those piles. The other thing is, if you don't have a front end loader, you can always with the shovel be able to just rotate that a little bit, or be able to dig holes down through it to get some oxygen in there. Well, the questions are going so fast I can't read them. Somebody says, what do we consider a low water table? Again, I was going to say, here I have a well that's 800 feet. That's a very deep well. When I was in Colorado, when I lived there, we had one that was 200 feet, and I'd consider that one, kind of a shallow well, and we had to pay close attention. We had a sandy soil, so we paid close attention to where we stockpiled manure. Okay, someone said they were interested in spreading manure daily, and if you're rotating your pastures, and if you know, some of the sessions that my university and E-Extension has had on pasture rotation, you rest those pastures for a minimum of 30 days, and if you're spreading manure on pastures that maybe are 60 days or 90 days away from being used, you really don't have to worry that much about pastures with parasites. If you have young foals and have had an ascard problem, that's probably the most difficult parasite to get rid of. Those parasite eggs, not composted, can last up to 9 years in the soil. If you have that problem, you may want to, there's some things you may have to talk to some professionals on how to get rid of that. Sometimes you may have to deep plow and reseed to turn that soil over to get rid of it, or you know, pay really close attention to a deworming program, and possibly putting up a pasture for young horses that other previous foals and yearlings have not been in. But if you're rotating pastures and spreading manure on those pastures that are rested for a long period of time, that kind of breaks that parasite cycle. Okay. Okay. Again, the width and height of those windrows, again, if it's too high, they're too difficult to manage. Generally, they're saying at least 3 to 4 feet high. It's gonna, the top's gonna fall down. You want to try to make them, you know, 3 to 4 feet wide, but they end up more like 6 feet wide over time as it breaks down. But you want to keep, like, if you keep turning the sides up, that helps quite a bit. Okay, the daily wormers someone's asking about, and those will take care of certain parasites. There's several other parasites that, you know, you're going to rotate different dewormers, and I think we may have some information on one of these programs coming up in the future that'll be covering more on parasites and different ones. But your daily dewormers, you know, read the label as to which product you're using, and you know, it's generally your strongyles and those parasites that are the ones that we worry about the most as far as, you know, the quick life cycle of those. And composting does, you know, kill those larva instars. The earth, someone mentioned about earthworms, and actually you'll notice once you start developing a healthy compost heat, there'll be an awful lot of earthworms that'll enter into that if you don't let it get too hot. Once you go through the curing stage, if you're stockpiling it there, you'll see a lot of earthworms move into it. But when it starts getting real hot, again, what would kill off the microorganisms, the bacteria, the protozoa, will also kill off your nematodes or your earthworms. So you want to, you know, if you're going to introduce any earthworms, or you'll start seeing a lot of earthworms after it's been composted, not during the active phase. Anything else you want to say about that, Mike? No, I don't think they are. I know they're not common in Pennsylvania at all, just in certain parts of the country. Someone asked if anyone's burning manure for heat. Actually, we had an entrepreneur not too far from Penn State University, where I'm from, that actually was doing that with different manures, and there may be something in that one for us in time. Someone's concerned about manure polluting water. Actually, there's a lot of studies being done on that. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation has a website. They're probably doing most of the research related to that. I know right now Penn State and University of Maryland and VPI Virginia is also involved in several studies with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation related to that, and they're trying to figure out what's polluting the Chesapeake Bay, whether it's manure or people's septic systems. Someone asked, can you add other manures to horse manure? And actually, outside of Denver, Colorado, there was, in one community, there was a large paint horse operation. They had 150 head and a phenomenal manure pile with a lot of sawdust. And right next door was a 300 cow dairy operation that just scraped their pens with no manure. And we put those two farms together. The dairy farmer was hauling that manure to his dairy farm off of the paint horse operation. And the last time I went out to Colorado, I was visiting with them. Now keep in mind, this is outside of Denver, where there is a high demand for good quality compost with nurserymen and landscapers. The dairyman told me that he was making more money off his compost operation than he was the dairy. Although as low as milk prices are today, that might not be hard to do. But, you know, yes, you can mix these different manures. What I'd recommend, though, it changes your fertilizing nutrient content of that, of your, you know, your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So you definitely would want to run a soil test on that compost before you utilized it on any fields or hay fields. The other thing too, if your composting pile needs more nitrogen, again, you can add commercial, you know, just the same thing you'd put on your lawn, like a high nitrogen fertilizer to kind of jumpstart it if you don't have enough horse manure or other animal manure to get the composting started. I was going to say there's some really good discussion up right now on earthworms. And again, he's saying you don't expect the earthworms to be in there when the compost pile is hot. I was going to say, are there any questions that were asked that haven't been answered at this time? If you can, things are slowed down. I know they were going pretty fast there for a while, and our folks answering questions couldn't keep up. So if anyone has any other questions. Actually, that is one of mine from last year. That's a half Arab, half quarter horse colt that that we bred. Actually, his sister was a paint half Arab and did really well as a reining horse. Thank you very much. We think so too.
Answer the Davis question. If you need more carbon and add grass, would it be down the same ratio? It would, because it's got more nitrogen.
Okay, someone earlier asked about putting grass clippings into your manure pile. Keep in mind the grass clippings is really high in nitrogen, so it acts as a green manure. Okay, what about fly spray systems in the barn? Are those detrimental to composting? There is a lot of questions, like, again, some of these, you know, anything that would kill nematodes or bacteria would also be detrimental in your compost pile. Even ivermectin at times kills nematodes because a parasite is a nematode, and so, you know, maybe that manure may affect it a little bit, but ivermectin breaks down very quickly in time, so generally by the time that little bit of manure is put into your manure pile, I don't think you have to worry about that. Can you run over manure with a lawnmower? Yeah, you can. That'll break it up. And actually, they suggest that you at least break up the manure piles in your pasture to expose it to the ultraviolet light of sun that'll then kill your parasite eggs. Okay. And actually, that won't hurt your lawn at all. The only problem you might get is some of the hay seeds you might now have, you know, hay grass in there. That's why they call them boot kickers. Okay, using leaves for bedding, I really would not use leaves for bedding. Horses will eat that. Then they get in a compacted gut, and then you have a terrible colic case. So I definitely would not use deciduous tree leaves, even in the fall. I've seen people throw that over their fence, and horses colic badly with compaction. But you can put those leaves into your compost pile. You may have to put more manure in there, grass clippings, or a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer. Actually, if you're composting a dead animal in winter, it's amazing how hot those piles will still heat up. A lot of us up here that, you know, we're still below freezing. If you check those compost piles with your thermometer, it's amazing how hot they are in the middle. Okay, it's past 8 o'clock, and I want to thank everybody for joining us. I was going to say, don't forget if your
Okay, and we would also like to thank Dr. Swinker for the
able to
presentation this evening, and we would also like to thank Michael for his help in answering the questions, as well as Dr. Skelly. Our next webcast will be on Tuesday, April 21st at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on the topic of feeding, and more specifically, the title is Countermeasure for Equine Laminitis, Carbohydrate Profiles in Feeds and Forages. And this is going to be presented by Dr. Bridget McIntosh from the University of Tennessee. And also please remember that these webcasts, I did put the URL down in the text chat, will be uploaded to our website by the end of the week. We have 18 other webcasts that are also available on our website for free that were recorded previously from other sessions such as this, and they're on a variety of topics from health to nutrition to reproduction, selection, and so forth. So once again, just go to www.myhorseuniversity.com for any of these additional sessions. So once again, thank you to everyone who attended this evening, and we hope you all have a great evening. Thank you.